Hey Malika, how are you?
Fine, thank you. How are you?
Well, I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. If you could please introduce yourself, your name, role, and your path to education.
My name is Malika Elwin. I am currently the Director of Campus Governance for the New York City Department of Education. My path to education is a little different. I came into education through law. I started litigating for the Department of Education in 2005. I was litigating special education cases. And decided that one, I'd been litigating for 10 years and I had reached my endpoint with litigation, not with law, but specifically with litigation, and wanted to do something else, but really enjoyed what I learned through special education and really wanted to continue on in that field in education, at that time specifically with special education, and decided to join a network support team, um, and started doing that in 2007 and became a little bit of a jack of all trades. So it took me through student support services, operations, ultimately became a network leader, opened up probably over 20 schools in New York City. Um, then took me to the Bronx High School Superintendent's office. And now this year I am with Campus Governance, which deals with schools in New York City that are on co-located campuses. So helping school leaders navigate that process and govern their building and deals with a lot of conflict resolution. So a lot of my experience in education has really been supporting school leaders in various ways and outside of the classroom, inside of the classroom with operations, with HR, with various things. And I've just really found a niche for myself and really enjoy it, and also just get to use my legal skills in that way, without having to drive myself crazy litigating.
I can appreciate that, and we thank you for your work, certainly. As an attorney and advocate, sort of what role do you believe the law can play in advancing the equity and access in education, and what are some specific changes, if you will, that you would like to see implemented to make that a reality?
Well, I think originally, um, the way I saw it, I think the laws aren't black and white. I think that it was helping school leaders really think about the laws that are applicable to schools with respect to special education, but also with respect to many things like compliance, uh, housing, safety, suspensions. Like there are so many things in education that have direct laws and regulations that relate to them. And I think that school leaders are often confused, right, around those laws and how they're applicable, but also how they can be applied in a way that are not harmful to students, right? I think that most education large organizations have attorneys that are a part of that organization, and principals reach out to them. And sometimes the answers are just, this is what the regulation says, this is what the law says, right? But there's no one there to help them like really think through that and really think about it from the school's perspective, from the student's perspective, from the parent's perspective, and really like navigating through that, right? And ultimately, we want to do things that really help students and don't hurt students, right? And so I think that you need someone that understands the law, but also really understands those different perspectives and can help a leader make decisions that don't hurt but help, right? And so there's all these confusing things like when do we reach out to an agency like maybe children's services, right? When things come up like chronic absenteeism, or when do we reach out when we, think that a student may be there's some neglect or abuse, maybe allegations or suspicions, right? So there's all these type of things that come up, suspensions, right? Like, when is it appropriate, right? When we're thinking about suspensions, when we're thinking about suspensions for Black and brown students, right? Like there's all these issues that come up. And I think that, you know, the issues come in hot and heavy, but sometimes you need that person that's just not going to just recite like the letter of the law to you, but just helps you also think through it, right? And that also goes into the issue of equity, right? And really creating what is uh, like emotional support for students, right? For parents, like this extra understanding, this extra layer. So I think that it has always been important. And I think that's one of the ways that it helped me really connect with building leaders to really understand like how schools work and what's important and how you support students. And supporting students is also in how you support leaders, right? And I think that a lot of times that's that missing element that you have in the support structure when you don't have someone who can understand both sides of it and help you put together a comprehensive plan around things like that.
Let's dive into that aspect, right? So in your role, right, you engage with multiple players, let's just say that, right? So how do you engage with and address the concerns or perspectives, right, of the diverse stakeholders that you mentioned, right? So students, families, educators, community members, et cetera.
I mean, I think it takes a certain amount of finesse. Um, I think a lot of times there for me it was a willingness to play the middleman between the school leader and various offices, right? There are certain actions that a student takes that require a certain type of disciplinary reaction, right? But with that also, a lot of times the student is going to return to the school community. We have to welcome the student back into the school community. How do we craft that type of response where that whatever that reaction has to be based on what the code says, right? Is also still supportive to the student that allows for some humanity within that, wherein it's just not pure discipline without really understanding the underlying things that have happened, right? In the community, culturally, like there are a lot of things that go into what happens in a student's life, and you have to like understand that and crafting a response. And so it's not just what's written on that piece of paper. And so a lot of times for leaders, it's also, you need a thought partner in that. And I think that's important to really think about that. And so we try to like marry all these different systems together. And sometimes the legal response just is it's black and white, right? But black and white doesn't work for most students. It just doesn't, right? It's not fair, it's not equitable. And it doesn't take into account like a lot of times like culturally, the social economics that's going on, in students' lives, especially in urban communities, right? So you really have to like think about those things when you're trying to also support students and communities and parents, and ultimately leaders and teachers, right? Because when you think about teaching and learning, right? Like teaching and learning, there's so many different components to that. And it just can't be about that black and white, there's no gray, right? And so one of the things I always say is I deal in the gray. I always deal in the gray. I have to deal in the gray when I'm thinking about students because if you don't, if there's no bend, right? How do you can't best support students in that way if there's no gray.
Yeah. Let's talk about data for a second, because data is a key component of your work, right?
Yes.
How do you ensure that data is used ethically and effectively, and what steps do you take to like make sure data is not used to perpetuate any biases or inequities?
So a lot of times with data, I'm a drill down with data type of person, right? And so recently, we were looking at some data that was specific to chronic absenteeism within certain districts in New York City. And so we were looking at it with respect to the barriers for students and why they don't come to school, right? And so, but when you're looking at data sets, right? And so the way that sometimes that data is given to you is given to you in very like broad strokes, right? And so it doesn't necessarily always drill down enough to really give you what you really need. It doesn't answer like all of the questions, right? And so if you're talking about like a specific district in New York City and you're talking about the barriers that prevent students from attending school for 10 or more days, right? And you're saying, oh, you're breaking it down, and you're breaking it down by ethnic groups, right? And you're saying, oh, District 8, this particular ethnic group, they don't attend school, their chronic absenteeism is 60%, right, for this particular school year. And so I'm looking at that particular data and I'm like, oh, 60% for, African and American students in this particular district, right? And so what's the age group for that? And so but I need to know the age group. We're talking about elementary students, right? We're talking about high school students. Are we talking about students that are overaged and undercredited? Are we talking about students that live not only in this district, but what's the poverty rate that we're talking about? Because in the district, depending on where you are in the district, the poverty rate may be different. Are we talking about students who may be experiencing homelessness, right, in that district, right? So we have to drill down on the data, right? When we're talking about, we can't talk about it in a broad stroke. We have to really drill down on it before, we get to like the barriers, right? Because if you define everything in these large strokes, you can't really see, you know, the real factors that are affecting like things like that because we're just dealing with it as this data set. And there's just so many factors, especially in urban areas, that I think one of the things that they were looking at, and I laughed. I'm originally from Michigan, and so they were comparing the chronic absenteeism rate in New York City for 2021, and it was for New York City, and they were comparing it to Detroit, right? And they just said Detroit, right? And so I'm from Michigan, and so I laughed because I was like, Detroit? Well, which area in Detroit? Like Southwest Detroit, you know, what specifically,
Great.
and it was
Yeah.
like Detroit was the highest. And I was just like, again, like, and it was just painting this picture, right? That just was trying to tell this story, but you can't tell that full story with that broad stroke. And it was just, you know, also this negative thing about Detroit based on just that. So it's just,
Well,
there's a reason why we can't do those things.
that's the operating in the gray that you mentioned before, right?
Yes.
So finally, Malika, so I feel like there's an article every day about something related to education in the public sector.
Yes.
But what are some emerging trends or challenges in the sector that you are seeing or currently focused on, and how are you working to address them?
I think currently, I think currently in my current position, I think that's probably one of the areas that I'm struggling in the most. I think a lot of the issues that I'm currently dealing with are adult issues, right? Really managing adult issues. And those adult issues aren't really trickling down to what is really happening in our schools with our students on a daily basis, right? So, our students in urban areas are really struggling with chronic absenteeism. They're struggling with literacy issues, right? They're struggling with math fluency. They're struggling definitely with issues around food insecurity. Um, they're struggling with issues around safety and security. And I think in this role, I don't think that it's definitely addressing those issues in those ways, um, which my prior role, I think, addressed more. Um, so I'm not in the classrooms enough to be able to help leaders like think through that and think through how we address those issues, right? And so I think since we've come back from the pandemic, I think leaders are also struggling with that gap, that large gap from the pandemic to post pandemic, right? And not necessarily having enough support, enough qualified teachers in the classroom to really address those needs. And I think what we're seeing from leadership down is this: leaders are struggling, teachers are struggling, students are struggling, parents are struggling, and there's just not enough answers right now. Um, and I think it's reflective in the data, it's reflected in the lack of engagement that we're seeing. Um, and I think it's reflective also in the fact that we just have a lot of leaders and a lot of teachers leaving schools,
Yes.
right? And so I think um, we need an answer for that, and we don't have it yet.
Yeah. Well, what I appreciate from this conversation and the push is to look and see things through the gray, right? I think we are always in the quest for what is efficient, what's effective, all the things that help us move faster, right? And certainly when you think in a very black and white fashion, you can kind of have the false impression that things are easier to accomplish than they actually are, or that you have a full and grounded picture, which you typically don't if it's that easy. And so I definitely appreciate Malika the push to look at what the data is telling us, not just the obvious things, but the not so obvious things, and making the connections for us to truly have the impact that we desire to have. This has been great, and I appreciate your time today, and I appreciate learning with you and from you. And I'm confident that folks watching this will have the same experience I did. So thank you.
Thank you.